The war was officially over, but for Aiko Tanaka, nothing felt finished. The rattling of the military truck beneath her seemed to echo the unrest still embedded in her bones. She sat pressed against the wooden panel, gripping a dented music box as if it were a lifeline. Around her, 19 other Japanese women rode in silence, their faces pale, their bodies swaying with every jolt of the vehicle. They had been moved from facility to facility, labeled not as individuals but as objects, comfort women, whose value was measured in silence and survival.
The rumors had followed them relentlessly. American soldiers were said to be wolves in uniform, brutes who would take what they wanted and leave no trace of mercy. Posters in their former camps warned of unspeakable acts awaiting those who surrendered to the enemy. No woman escaped, they were told. No woman was spared. Aiko didn't know which was worse, the violence she had already endured or the new kind they promised lay ahead. As the truck approached the perimeter of the American POW camp, the road narrowed, hemmed in by dense jungle and the clinging fog of the Pacific. The humid air clung to her skin, thick with diesel fumes and fear. When the vehicle finally came to a halt, no one moved until ordered. The command came, curt but not shouted. Slowly the women climbed down, their thin shoes sinking into the mud, their eyes darting from soldier to soldier, expecting leers or commands. But what they saw instead was order. A sign written in clear Japanese hung by the gate. No American soldier may touch any prisoner. Report all violations. The absurdity of it struck Aiko like a sudden slap. Was this another game? Some calculated performance to make them drop their guard? The soldiers standing by the entrance kept their eyes averted and hands visible, their posture oddly respectful. It made no sense. They were led through the gates in single file, past barbed wire fences and wooden barracks that looked more like temporary shelters than prisons. The compound smelled of wet soil, soap, and metal. Everything was unnervingly clean. No one yelled, no one grabbed. A female nurse handed Aiko a towel and gestured toward a washing station without saying a word. The silence, combined with civility, felt more terrifying than hostility. Inside the barracks, cots were neatly arranged. Each had a folded blanket and a piece of paper taped to the frame. When Aiko looked closer, she saw her name typed in Roman letters. Not a number, not a code, her name. It startled her more than she expected. She had almost forgotten how it looked outside of handwriting. That night, she lay on the cot, staring at the wooden ceiling, waiting for the inevitable sound of boots or a creaking door. But nothing came. The barrack remained quiet, broken only by the occasional cough or whisper. No one entered. No one demanded. Her heart refused to believe the peace was real. She clutched the music box under her blanket, its dented edges pressing into her ribs. Hours passed. Sleep did not come easily, but neither did violence. When dawn broke, Aiko sat up slowly and looked around at the others. Their faces were just as uncertain as hers, caught between disbelief and dread. None of them spoke, as if acknowledging the night's quiet would somehow jinx it. But deep inside, something fragile stirred. Not hope, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of fear they had all built around themselves. Sergeant Thomas Reed stood inside the makeshift medical tent, adjusting the position of a small chalkboard on the canvas wall. With deliberate strokes, he wrote out 3 lines in block letters. No touching. Female nurse present. Keep hands visible. These weren't just instructions, they were a commitment. Having served in multiple Pacific campaigns, Reed knew that rules, even simple ones, could shape a battlefield of morality. Here, in a place stained by so much unseen suffering, clarity mattered more than compassion. Outside, the women were being lined up for medical evaluation. Their expressions hovered between suspicion and exhaustion.
Some glanced around nervously, unsure whether to brace for commands or violence. Aiko stood near the end of the line, gripping her towel tightly and avoiding eye contact. Her body was tense, trained by habit to expect the worst. But the only voices she heard were soft instructions from the female nurses, translated with care by a Japanese-American interpreter.
Kenji Sato, the translator, was young but carried himself with quiet dignity. The irony of his role did not escape him. While his own parents remained confined in an internment camp in California, he now served as the bridge between two worlds fractured by war. Every phrase he delivered was chosen carefully, not just for accuracy, but for tone. He introduced the procedures, clarified expectations, and repeated again, "No American soldier will touch you." It sounded almost absurd, but he repeated it anyway. Each woman stepped forward, was given a fresh cotton shift, and escorted inside the medical tent. There, only female nurses conducted the physical checks. The process was efficient, sterile, and profoundly different from what any of them had endured before. Reed stood in the corner with a clipboard, eyes lowered, hands clasped behind his back. When questions arose, he asked Kenji to translate, ensuring the women were never addressed directly in ways that might seem threatening. Aiko watched as the line moved slowly. Every step felt like walking through a fog of disbelief. The nurses never shouted. No male soldier leered. When Aiko's turn came, her heart pounded as she stepped over the threshold into the canvas space. The smell of disinfectant was sharp but clean. A nurse gestured to a cot and offered a soft instruction, her face free of judgment. Aiko obeyed, uncertain whether the surreal kindness was more frightening than cruelty. As the examination began, Aiko's muscles stayed tight, expecting the inevitable betrayal. But it never came. The nurse worked quickly and respectfully, never lingering, never prying more than necessary. When she was finished, she helped Aiko back into the clean shift, gave a brief nod, and recorded her condition on a form. Outside, the sun filtered through the canvas, throwing soft light across the room, as if nature itself was unsure how to act in this strange space of restraint. Reed stayed silent through the process, his presence both necessary and invisible. He watched each woman with the trained eye of a medic, noting signs of malnutrition, bruising, fatigue. He did not speak unless required, and even then, his words were filtered through Kenji. This distance, he believed, was its own kind of respect. He wasn't here to fix what had been done. He could only make sure no further damage occurred under his watch. Later, as the women returned to their barracks, some walked with their heads slightly higher. Others looked back at the medical tent as if expecting it to vanish like a mirage. Aiko said nothing, but inside, a question began to take root. If this was the enemy, then who had lied to them all these years? Her distrust remained, but now it had company: confusion, disbelief, and a dangerous flicker of curiosity. That evening, the compound was quiet again. The routine, so structured and precise, continued without incident. Guards kept their distance. Nurses moved from tent to tent. The women spoke little, but in their shared glances was the beginning of something unspoken, a recognition that perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Not yet trust, not even relief, but the first fragile outline of another truth. The camp's daily routines began to take shape with mechanical regularity. Every morning, a list was posted with work assignments: laundry duty, kitchen help, uniform repair. Each woman was expected to contribute, but not under duress. They received paper slips labeled credits, redeemable for essentials like soap, paper, and even sweets. The idea of being compensated for labor rather than exploited was so foreign that many were suspicious at first. Aiko was assigned to the sewing station, where worn American uniforms were brought for mending. The fabric was heavy,
The buttons strange, but her hands remembered the work. Before the war, she had sewn dresses for younger cousins and hemmed trousers for her father. Now, needle and thread felt like a link to a past untouched by violence. The women around her worked in silence, broken only by quiet sighs and the occasional whispered question.
Beside her sat Sumiko, a woman with tired eyes and an unexpectedly warm laugh. At one point, while threading a stubborn needle, Sumiko murmured, "This cloth smells clean." It was such a simple observation, yet it startled Aiko. Clean had once meant safety, pride, order, things that had long since disappeared from their world. That a scent could trigger a memory of peace was a truth Aiko hadn't considered in years. Later that day, the women were brought to a wooden building that had been turned into a rudimentary classroom. On the chalkboards were neatly written English phrases. "Good morning," "Please help me," "Where is the doctor?" The sentences were odd and awkward, but learning them felt oddly empowering. Lieutenant Hale stood at the front with a pointer in hand, explaining the basics through Kenji's translations. Her tone was strict, but not unkind. When Hale drew a diamond shape on the board and began explaining the rules of baseball, the room filled with puzzled expressions. For women who had lived through war, this American pastime seemed absurdly irrelevant. But it wasn't just about the game. It was about language, context, normalcy. Aiko raised her hand during the lesson and asked, "Is stealing allowed here?" Her question, rooted in cultural and moral confusion, drew a rare laugh from Kenji. The translator explained with a smile that in baseball, stealing meant running quickly between bases, not committing a crime. The clarification brought a ripple of unexpected laughter through the room. It was brief, almost fragile, but real. Aiko felt the corners of her mouth twitch, an instinct she thought she had lost. The act of smiling, even at a small absurdity, felt like reclaiming a part of herself. In the dining hall, meals were served at regular intervals. The portions were strange and foreign. Canned peaches, powdered eggs, salty meats, but they were generous. Aiko watched the syrup from a peach slice drip onto her tray, fascinated by its golden color. Her stomach clenched in response, unsure whether to trust this sudden abundance. She nibbled cautiously, eyes darting around the table to see if others did the same. That night, the women returned to their barracks carrying small notebooks and pencils. They had been encouraged to write letters to surviving family, though few addresses were still valid. Aiko stared at the blank page in front of her, overwhelmed by the weight of words unspoken. After so much silence, where does one begin? Eventually, she wrote her name at the top. Seeing it in her own hand felt like the beginning of something irreversible. Though she couldn't name it, Aiko felt a change stirring inside. No one had touched her. No one had shouted. Her body remained hers. But more than that, her name had been restored, not as a file number or whispered shame, but as an identity acknowledged by others. The war had taken everything. And yet, within this strange orderly prison, something small was being returned. As the days in the camp settled into quiet patterns, a new kind of tension began to form just outside its boundaries. From the male prisoner compound, whispers of suspicion turned into angry mutterings. Leaflets written in Japanese appeared near the outer fences, claiming the Americans were only pretending during the day. According to the flyers, the women were still being used, just after dark, when no one was watching. The rumors spread fast, clinging to the fence line like smoke. Captain Briggs, the camp commander, received reports of the pamphlets with growing concern. He knew that in wartime, lies could travel faster than truth, especially when truth was quiet and uneventful. The women had been treated with care and restraint, but outside observers refused to believe it. Some of the male prisoners considered the women's relative peace a form of betrayal.
Honor, they said, was being lost through cooperation.
Aiko first heard the rumors when she passed the eastern fence and saw a leaflet caught in the wire. She couldn't read it clearly, but the expressions on the guards' faces told her enough. Something was being said about them, something ugly. That evening, her steps grew more cautious, her conversations more guarded. The fragile sense of safety she had begun to accept started to crack under the pressure of invisible accusations.
Then came the stone. Thrown from the male compound, it struck the side of the women's barracks during dinner. Several women screamed and ducked for cover, instinctively remembering nights when such sounds meant something far worse. An American MP fired a warning shot into the air, freezing the tension for a moment. The guards moved quickly to restore order, but the damage had been done. The camp, once a place of quiet routine, felt on edge again.
Lieutenant Hale responded with visible frustration. She walked the compound with a clipboard, posting new notices in both English and Japanese. There would be roll calls every 2 hours, limited gatherings, and increased patrols. The message was clear: discipline would not waver, even under pressure. But to the women, the new rules felt like retreat. They had been allowed a glimpse of freedom, only to see it shrink again under suspicion.
Kenji, ever watchful, tried to reassure the women. He explained that the Americans were responding to threats, not punishing them. Yet his own voice carried doubt. He had seen this before, how fear of scandal could overrule compassion. He feared that if one soldier slipped, if one boundary was crossed, the entire effort to treat the women humanely would collapse, and that collapse would not be quiet.
Aiko tried to ignore the storm brewing outside. She focused on her sewing, on her writing lessons, on the rhythm of ordinary days. But inside, anxiety returned like a shadow creeping through a crack in the wall. Every noise at night made her flinch again. Every unexpected knock on the door sent a jolt through her chest. Safety, it seemed, was as fragile as memory.
Later that week, she overheard 2 soldiers speaking in hushed tones near the infirmary. One of them was reprimanded for offering chocolate to a woman at the fence. It was meant as kindness, but it violated protocol. The officer's voice was calm but firm. Rules must be enforced, even for good intentions. Aiko watched from a distance, heart pounding, realizing something profound. They were not just pretending. The Americans were enforcing boundaries for real. That night, she lay awake listening to the sound of rain on the metal roof. She wound the music box, but the melody had grown thin and slow. The notes trembled in the air like a memory too faint to hold. Around her, other women lay silent, alert, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Outside the fences, the lies kept circling like vultures. But inside, for now, the rules still held. The tension in the camp continued to simmer just beneath the surface, like heat beneath the floorboards. The rumors outside the wire refused to die, fueled by prejudice and the stubborn refusal to accept that the enemy could be humane. For many of the Japanese male prisoners, the idea that the women were being treated with dignity was impossible to believe. They insisted it was a performance, a deception staged for the Red Cross or foreign observers. The truth, they said, would reveal itself eventually, through scandal or exposure. Captain Briggs knew the danger of silence. Without a formal rebuttal, the lies would grow louder, more persuasive. That's when Kenji proposed something radical, an assembly where the women could testify voluntarily. They would speak for themselves, describe their experience, and let the words be documented. There would be no coercion, no rehearsals, no censorship. Only their voices, translated and recorded in both English and Japanese. The plan was approved, though not without hesitation. Some officers feared it would appear staged, or worse, that it would provoke retaliation from those who refused to accept the testimony. But there was no alternative.
The quiet truth of the women's lives needed to stand against the loudness of slander. The announcement was made discreetly, and the women were given the option to write their statements in private. Aiko spent 2 days drafting hers with trembling hands. She wrote simply, plainly, without flourishes. She described the clean sheets, the untouched body, the soap, the name card on her bed. She described the moment when she realized that no American soldier would lay hands on her, not even with permission. Her words were not political, not poetic. They were fragments of lived reality, stitched together like the uniforms she mended. When she handed her statement to Kenji, he read it slowly, then looked up and nodded once. "It is enough," he said, and it was. On the morning of the assembly, the sky hung heavy with clouds, and tarps were stretched between buildings to keep the rain off. Rows of benches were arranged in the open square, facing a small wooden platform. One side filled with American officers and staff, the other with Japanese male prisoners, including Lieutenant Nakamura. Aiko stood in the barracks holding the printed version of her statement. Her name was at the top in block letters, Aiko Tanaka. She felt the paper shake in her hands. Sumiko stood beside her and whispered that she didn't have to go. Aiko didn't answer. She stepped outside and walked to the platform, each step slower than the last, as if the mud itself wanted to hold her back, but she kept walking. When she reached the front, Kenji stood beside her, ready to translate. She took a breath and began. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper at first. She said they were warned the Americans would harm them, but that harm never came. She said they were given food, names, wages, and safety. She said no man touched her, and no woman was shamed. Each sentence was followed by silence, then translation, then more silence. Lieutenant Nakamura watched with a cold, unmoving expression. A few of the male prisoners shifted uncomfortably, others looked away. But Aiko kept reading. She said the dignity they were promised had been honored, that she had not been used, that her body, for the first time in years, had been hers alone. Her voice trembled, but her hands stayed steady. When she finished, the square was so quiet that the sound of the ocean beyond the compound could be heard. A single bird called from the jungle. The moment held, not as a performance, not as proof, but as presence. The truth had been spoken, and it didn't matter who believed it. It existed now, beyond rumor, beyond fear. A name on paper, a voice in the rain. In the days following the assembly, the atmosphere in the camp shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The new rules remained posted, the extra patrols continued, and the men on the outside still whispered. But within the women's compound, something had been reclaimed. The fear that once clung to every movement began to loosen. The testimony had not erased the past, but it had drawn a line beneath it. Aiko resumed her daily routines with quiet determination. In the sewing room, her hands moved with practiced ease, repairing sleeves and reinforcing collars. She no longer flinched when a guard passed by the window. The rhythm of the needle became meditative, grounding her in something steady. Even the familiar hum of Sumiko beside her took on new meaning, a sound of endurance rather than survival. One afternoon, as Aiko walked near the fence, she saw a young American soldier sweeping the pathway. He looked up, saw her, and nodded politely before returning to his task. There was no attempt at conversation, no inappropriate smile, just a shared understanding of distance and recognition. That moment, so small, felt monumental. It was the kind of respect that did not need words. At night, the barracks remained still. The women lay in their cots, breathing evenly, no longer frozen in tension. Rain tapped gently on the tin roof, and the sound no longer resembled gunfire. Aiko kept the broken music box beneath her pillow,
not for the tune it no longer played, but for the memory it carried. It had survived, as she had, and now it served as a silent witness to something new.
Letters were written again, and this time a few received replies. One woman learned that her sister was alive in Osaka. Another was told her village had been destroyed, but her cousin had made it to Tokyo. Aiko still had no response. Her letter had returned with a red stamp and the words, "Address unknown." She reread it anyway, tracing the characters with her finger as if to keep them from fading. Captain Briggs, after reviewing reports and photographs from the assembly, ordered copies of the testimonies to be sent to the Red Cross and U.S. headquarters. He knew it might not be enough to counter every rumor, but it would stand as an official record. If questioned, he could point to paper and signatures and witnesses. But beyond that, he seemed changed. His visits to the compound grew more frequent, his voice softer, his presence less authoritative and more present. Kenji continued his work, moving between languages and people, always careful, always steady. He noticed that when he called women by name now, they answered with more confidence. They stood straighter. They asked questions. The act of being seen, truly seen, had begun to alter the way they saw themselves. He thought often about his parents in California and how the same war had touched them in a different way. On the final day of the month, a group photograph was taken at the edge of the camp. The women stood in plain cotton dresses, shoulders squared, some smiling faintly, others simply staring at the camera with unreadable expressions. Aiko stood near the center, the broken music box hidden in her pocket. Behind them, the jungle loomed, wild and indifferent. But the photo captured something still, something solid, proof that they had been there, that they had lived not just as shadows, but as people with names. Long after the war would be reduced to dates and footnotes, Aiko would remember the way the rain sounded that week, not like bombs or boots, but like water-cleansing stone. She would remember the chalkboard with rules written in her language, the soldier who looked away, not out of shame, but respect. And above all, she would remember the miracle she never thought possible, not freedom, but dignity, untouched, unstolen, hers.